My daughter-in-law called me at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the second I heard her voice crack on the word hospital, I knew this wasn't going to be the kind of phone call you forget by morning. She said Marcus had been in an accident, that he was stable, that I shouldn't worry, and then she said the one sentence that told me she was lying about all of it. She said, "His boss is here at the hospital with us. He's been so kind." I want you to sit with that for a second, because I did, standing barefoot in my kitchen at 11 at night. And something about a boss showing up at the hospital before the man's own father got there didn't sit right with me. Welcome back if you're new here, and welcome back if you've been with me a while. If this is your first time landing on this channel, drop the state you're watching from down in the comments. I like to see the map fill in. And if you're the kind of person who believes a father doesn't stop being a father just because his son's grown and married, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because I've got more stories like this one coming. My son's name is Marcus. He's 31. Before I tell you what happened to him at that hospital, and what happened after, I need you to understand the kind of man he is, because none of the rest of it makes sense without that part first. Marcus was the kid who, when he was 16, found out our mail carrier's husband had passed, and for the entire next winter, without telling a soul, he'd get up before school and clear her walkway and her driveway before she ever made her rounds. I only found out because she wrote me a card that spring, thanking me for raising a boy like that. I asked Marcus about it at dinner, and he just shrugged and said the woman had enough on her plate. That's who my son is. He doesn't do things to be seen doing them. 6 years ago, Marcus married a woman named Dana, and Dana's family runs a regional trucking and logistics company out of Reading, Pennsylvania, a business her father built from 2 trucks into a fleet of almost 60. Her father's name is Roland Voss, and Roland is the kind of man who walks into a room and starts calculating who in it he can use and who he can ignore. Roland brought Marcus into the company right after the wedding, gave him a title, dispatch operations manager, and made a whole production out of it at the reception, standing up with a glass of champagne and telling 200 guests he was welcoming a son into the family business. What Roland never said out loud, but made obvious in 100 small ways over 6 years, was that he saw Marcus as free labor with a wedding ring attached, not as family, and certainly not as an equal. I'm 62 years old. I spent 35 years running an equipment leasing company here in the Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania, called Whitfield Industrial Leasing. My father started it in 1968, leasing forklifts and pallet jacks to warehouses, and I grew it into something that leases heavy trucks, trailers, and loading equipment to logistics companies across 3 counties. It is not exciting work. It is contracts and maintenance schedules and quarterly renewals, but it taught me how to read a balance sheet the way some men read a room, and it taught me patience with people who think patience is the same thing as weakness. My failure, and I'll own this straight out, is that for 6 years I let Marcus manage his relationship with his father-in-law without me stepping in, because I told myself, a grown married man doesn't need his father running interference. I watched Roland make comments at Christmas dinners about how Marcus had married up, and I'd grip my fork a little tighter and keep my mouth shut, because I thought that's what respecting my son's marriage looked like. The night it happened was a Tuesday in late October. There was a company dinner, one of those mandatory ones Roland threw, twice a year for senior staff and family, at a steakhouse downtown that he liked because the private room had his name on a little brass plaque by the door, a small vanity he'd paid extra for. I wasn't there. I'm never invited to those, only the big holidays, if that. I got the story afterward, first in pieces from Dana over the phone that night, and then in full, weeks later, from someone who'd been standing closer to it than anyone realized at the time. Dinner started at 7. By 7:45, Roland had already brought up a shipment that had been delayed out of the Harrisburg depot, a mechanical failure on one of the trucks that had nothing to do with dispatch and everything to do with a maintenance contractor. Roland himself had switched to 6 months earlier to save money. Marcus tried to explain the timeline, calmly, the way he explains everything, and Roland cut him off in front of the entire table and said that a real logistics man doesn't let his trucks break down, he plans around it. Marcus, still not raising his voice, said maybe if they'd kept the old maintenance contractor instead of chasing a cheaper quote, the truck wouldn't have failed in the first place. That was the whole exchange. That was all it took. Roland stood up from his seat at the head of that table, walked around it, and shoved Marcus hard enough that my son's chair tipped backward and he went down onto the private room's hardwood floor, cracking the back of his head against the leg of a side table on the way down. That's the injury that put him in the hospital. Not a car accident. Not anything Dana had told me on the phone. A push from her own father, in front of a room full of his employees and his family, hard enough to split the back of my son's scalp open on furniture. Nobody at that table got up to help him first. Dana told me later the first person who moved was the woman sitting 2 seats down, a name I'd hear a great deal more about in the weeks to come, Priya Anand, the company's head of fleet compliance. She was on the floor next to Marcus before anyone else had even pushed their chair back, pressing a cloth napkin against the back of his head, telling him to stay still, don't sit up too fast. And while she was doing that, while my son was bleeding onto a white tablecloth, Dana looked at her husband on the floor and said, "You really had to push him, Dad? Now he's going to make this into something." Not, "Are you okay?" Not a word to her father about what he'd just done. She said it like Marcus, falling down and cracking his skull open, was an inconvenience he was creating for the family. Marcus told me weeks later that the silence in that room in the seconds after wasn't shock. It was the same kind of quiet you get in a room where everyone's been waiting a long time for something ugly to finally surface. And instead of being horrified, some part of them was relieved. It was finally out in the open. Priya rode with him in the ambulance. Dana followed in her own car, 10 minutes behind, because she said she needed to find her purse first. I want to tell you about Priya Anand, because she matters to everything that comes after this. She'd been at Voss Logistics for 9 years by then, ran fleet compliance, which meant she was the one person in that company who actually knew, down to the VIN number, which trucks were legal to be on the road, and which ones Roland was quietly keeping in service past their inspection windows to save money. She wasn't family. She had no reason to follow Marcus out to that ambulance bay except that it was the right thing to do, and she'd apparently been the kind of person who did the right thing quietly, over and over, for 9 years, whether or not Roland noticed or cared. At the hospital, it was Priya who was there when I finally got Dana on the phone and heard that strange detail about the boss being present and being so kind. Priya had driven Marcus, sat with him through the CT scan, and was still there when I called, standing in the hallway so Dana could take the call in the room. When Dana handed the phone to Marcus for a minute, my son, with 11 stitches in the back of his head, still tried to tell me it was a slip and fall. He said the floor was wet near the kitchen door. I heard the machines beeping behind him and I said, "Marcus, I need you to tell me the truth because your voice doesn't sound like a man who slipped on a wet floor." There was a long pause, and then he told me, all of it. Here's the part I didn't say to Marcus that night, because I didn't want to hand him false hope before I'd worked out whether I could actually do anything with it. Voss Logistics doesn't own its main depot point. The 40-acre yard and warehouse complex off Route 61 outside, Reading, the one with Roland's 60 trucks parked on it every night, sits on land and under a building that my company, Whitfield Industrial Leasing, has owned and leased to Voss Logistics for the last 19 years. My father's original leasing agreements were mostly for equipment, but back in 2007, when Roland's father was still running the business, the old man asked if we'd finance and lease the depot facility itself as part of an expansion, and we did, on a long-term commercial lease that had auto-renewed every 3 years since, quietly, without me ever giving it much thought, because my office manager, a woman named Carla Jimenez, who's handled Whitfield's contracts for going on 15 years, processed the renewal like clockwork every time it came up. That renewal date happened to be December 15th, 7 weeks away. I hadn't looked closely at that lease in years. It never occurred to me I'd need to, because it never occurred to me my son's father-in-law would put him in a hospital bed over a trucking delay. For 4 days after the accident, I didn't do anything but visit Marcus and sit with my own anger. I told myself I was gathering facts. Really, I was doing what I'd done for 6 years straight, turning it over quietly in my head, waiting to see if this would somehow resolve itself the way every other slight from Roland Voss had resolved itself, which is to say, it never actually resolved. It just got absorbed and buried and brought back up at the next holiday dinner in a slightly different shape. I drove past the depot on Route 61 on my way to visit a client, and I slowed down at the gate longer than I needed to, looking at the rows of trailers with the Voss Logistics logo peeling on some of the older ones, and I still didn't pick up the phone. What actually changed my mind was the following Monday morning, when Dana called Marcus, who was still home recovering with a mild concussion, and asked if he was coming back to work that week, because dispatch was short-staffed and her father needed him. Not, "How's your head?" Not one word about the 11 stitches, or the CT scan, or the fact that her own father had put her husband on the floor of a steakhouse. Just, "Is he coming in? Because the business needs him." That was the moment something in me stopped waiting around to see how this would play out on its own and started deciding how it was going to play out instead. I called my attorney, a man named Frank Del Vecchio, who's handled every Whitfield industrial contract for better than 25 years, and I asked him one direct question. What happens on December 15th if we simply choose not to renew the depot lease? Frank told me it was about as clean as these things get. No penalty clause triggered on either side. No outstanding obligation. Nothing owed in either direction. Because the lease had a standard 90-day non-renewal notice provision that neither party had ever needed to invoke before. If we gave proper written notice, Voss Logistics would have 90 days to vacate the depot it had operated out of for nearly 2 decades. I want to be straight with you about something. I never once considered showing up at that steakhouse or that depot to confront Roland Voss with my fists. That thought never seriously crossed my mind, not for 1 minute. What I considered instead was this. Roland had built his entire operation, his whole 60-truck fleet, and his brass plaque vanity dinners. On land my family had financed and controlled for 19 years, and in all that time, he'd treated the people who worked under him, including my own son, like furniture he was entitled to knock over whenever he felt like it. I decided he was welcome to keep running his business exactly the way he'd always run it, just not standing on ground that belonged to my family. I called Priya Anand directly, not through Marcus, not through Dana. I looked up the main line for Voss Logistics and asked the receptionist to connect me to fleet compliance, and when Priya picked up, I told her exactly who I was. I told her I knew what she'd done in that private dining room and in that ambulance, and I asked her one question. If Voss Logistics lost the lease on that depot, would she be interested in helping stand up a new logistics operation on the same land, under new ownership, run the right way? She went quiet on the line for a long moment, long enough that I thought the call had dropped, and then she said, "Mr. Whitfield, I've been the only person keeping that fleet legal and safe for 9 years, while Roland Voss cut every corner he could get away with and took credit for the ones I fixed. Yes, absolutely yes. That was the entire plan, and it wasn't complicated. I had no interest in ruining Roland Voss's life. I was simply done being the reason he had anywhere to park a single truck. Through November, the notices went out exactly the way they're supposed to go out. Certified mail, dated, formal, 90 days, as the lease required to the letter. I didn't call Roland myself. I let Frank's office handle every piece of that correspondence, clean and procedural, nothing personal in a single sentence of it, because I wanted there to be nothing he could point to later and call spite. Meanwhile, Carla and I quietly started drafting a new lease agreement, this one with Priya Anand, and a regional investment group she'd brought in within about 10 days of that phone call, for a new logistics operation that would take over the same 40 acres by early spring under a completely different name. Marcus was offered a genuine equity partnership in that new company, not a desk his father-in-law could shove him out of whenever a shipment ran late. Roland didn't understand what had landed on his desk right away. The notice sat in his corporate mailroom for 9 days before someone finally flagged it up to him. When he did understand it, the calls started. 6 on a Wednesday, then 13 more by that Friday. By the following Tuesday, I had 41 missed calls from a reading area code I didn't have saved in my phone, and I knew exactly whose number it was. He had no idea, calling and calling like that, that I already knew precisely how this was going to end. I just hadn't decided yet whether the man deserved a face-to-face conversation about it. I decided he did. I'm not a man who hides from consequences of my own making. We met at my office on a Thursday morning, the 4th of December, 9 o'clock sharp, because I told his assistant that was the only slot I had that week, and I wasn't moving it. He walked in wearing a suit that looked like it cost more than my first truck lease ever brought in, the kind of suit meant to remind everyone in the room who's supposed to be in charge of it. He sat down across from my desk and said, "You're really going to do this to family over a workplace disagreement?" I said, "You put your hands on my son hard enough to split his scalp open in front of a room full of your own employees? And your daughter's first words to him on that floor were about how he was making things difficult for you. That's not a workplace disagreement, Roland. That's the reason we're sitting here." He tried 3 separate angles in that meeting, the same way men like that always do. First, that I owed him consideration as extended family. Then, that Marcus had exaggerated a simple accidental fall. Then, when neither of those landed anywhere, that I'd regret losing a tenant who'd never once been late on a rent payment in 19 years. My voice never rose through any of it. It didn't need to. I told him the paperwork was already final, that Priya Anand and her partners would be taking over depot operations by spring, and that Marcus would be joining them as a partner and part owner, not an employee anyone could shove to the floor. I watched something in his face go very still the moment I said Priya's name. Like it was only in that instant he fully understood exactly who had been keeping his entire fleet road legal and running for 9 straight years while he took the bows for it. He stood up to leave and said from the doorway, "She's my daughter, Walter. Dana is never going to forgive you for this." I told him that forgiveness wasn't really his to negotiate on Dana's behalf, and it wasn't something I was losing sleep over either way. That part, I meant, every word of it. Voss Logistics vacated the Route 61 depot at the end of February. Roland tried relocating to a smaller lot on the far side of Reading, one without the highway frontage or the visibility he'd had for nearly 20 years. And from what I've heard through people who still talk to people in that industry, it's been a rough go for him. I didn't lift a finger to make that happen beyond exactly what I've already told you. I simply stopped propping up a man who never once stopped to wonder why the ground under his own trucks had stayed so steady for so long without him having to think about it. Marcus and Priya opened the new operation on that same 40 acres in April, under the name Route 61 Freight. I drove out for the opening morning. Marcus shook my hand at the gate instead of hugging me, which told me more about what that morning meant to him than any words could have. Some men hold themselves together that way, staying formal in the moment, because if they let themselves feel the whole thing all at once, they're not sure they'd get through it standing up. I understood exactly what that handshake was doing for him, because I've done the same thing myself more than once in my life. Dana didn't come to the opening. She and Marcus separated in March, about 6 weeks before the ribbon was cut on that lot. I won't sit here and tell you that part doesn't weigh on me some nights, because it does. I didn't do any of this to end my son's marriage. I did it because I couldn't stand by and watch him spend the rest of his working life flinching every time he walked into a room his father-in-law controlled. But I'll tell you honestly, if Dana had gotten down on that floor beside her husband instead of worrying about how his injury was going to inconvenience the family, none of the rest of this would have needed to happen at all. I think about that more than I think about Roland Voss most days. I don't need an apology out of that man. I don't believe he has one in him, and I stopped waiting a long time ago for people to become something other than what they've shown me over and over they already are. What I've got instead now is a standing Saturday morning coffee with Marcus out at the new depot before the first trucks roll out for the day. Watching my son walk that yard like it's finally his to walk, shoulders back, not bracing for a single thing. That's enough for me. It's more than enough, if I'm honest. It's the first time in 6 years I've watched my son stand somewhere and not brace himself for what might be coming next. If this story landed with you tonight, do me a favor and hit that like button, and subscribe if you haven't already. It genuinely helps this channel more than you'd guess. And if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace in your own family and standing up for your kid, I want to hear it. Tell me down in the comments. This has been another story from me. and I'll see you in the next one.